There's a moment where David loses the person who loved him most in this world. Jonathan, his closest friend, the one who stripped off his royal robe and gave it to David when David had nothing, the one who made a covenant with him when Saul was hunting David like an animal, the one who told him, "You will be king, and I will be second to you," and meant it, without bitterness, without jealousy, without condition. The one person on earth who saw exactly who David was and stayed anyway. And Jonathan dies right before David becomes king, not after, not years later when David had settled into the throne. Right before, 3 days before the crown lands on David's head, his best friend is gone. Now here's the question nobody asks about that story. Was that timing an accident? Because most of us, when someone we love is removed from our life, we treat it as a rupture, a tragedy, evidence that something went wrong. We spend months, sometimes years, mourning the loss, asking why, wondering what we could have done differently. But what if God removes people on purpose? What if the people who left, the friendships that ended, the relationships that dissolved, the seasons with certain people that closed, what if none of that was random? What if it was surgical? Let me say something that might be hard to hear, and I want you to stay with me. God is not passive about who is in your life. He is not watching from a distance, shrugging when relationships fall apart. He is not surprised when a friendship ends or a door closes on a season. Proverbs 16:9 says, "A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." Not just the big steps, the small ones, the ones that include who walks beside you and who walks away. Which means when someone is removed from your life, when the relationship ends, when the friendship fades, when the person you built your world around is suddenly no longer there, there are really only two possibilities. Either it was an accident, or it was an assignment. And the Bible doesn't leave much room for accidents. So today, I want to walk through 5 reasons God removes people from your life. Not to minimize your grief, what you lost was real, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't, but to give you a frame that might change what you do with that grief. Because there's a difference between mourning a loss and understanding a removal. The first reason: some people are sent for a season, not a lifetime. And when the season ends, they have to leave. This is the one people resist the most, because we weren't built for temporary. We attach deeply. That's not a flaw. That's how God designed us. But not every relationship God sends is designed to last forever. Some are designed to last exactly as long as they're supposed to. Look at John the Baptist. His entire life, his entire purpose, was pointed at one moment, the day he would see Jesus coming toward him at the Jordan River and say, "Behold, the Lamb of God." That was the apex, the thing he was built for. And after that moment, John's ministry began to shrink. His disciples started following Jesus instead, and John said something that should rewrite how we think about seasonal people in our lives. He said, "He must increase, but I must decrease." John didn't fight it. He didn't mourn it. He didn't spend 6 months processing why his ministry was fading. He understood that his season had a purpose, and when the purpose was complete, the season was complete. He was sent to prepare the way. When the way arrived, John's job was done. Now think about your own life. Think about the mentor who poured into you for 2 years, then seemed to pull back. The friend who was there for the hardest season of your life, then drifted when things got better. The community that felt like home until it suddenly didn't. What if they weren't failing you? What if they were finishing? What if the grace on that relationship was specifically for that season, and when the season ended, God in his mercy, not his cruelty, let it close? Ecclesiastes 3 says there's a time for everything, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Not everything that ends is broken. Some things end because they're complete. The second reason: the person God removed was a ceiling on what you could become. This one stings more. because the person wasn't bad, the relationship wasn't toxic, but something about staying in it was keeping you small. Paul and Barnabas. If you want a masterclass in how God uses conflict to multiply impact, look at what happened between these two. They had traveled together, planted churches together, been through imprisonment together. Barnabas was the one who vouched for Paul when every Christian in Jerusalem was afraid of him. He believed in Paul before Paul had proven anything. Then they disagreed sharply over whether to bring John Mark on their next journey. John Mark had abandoned them on a previous trip, and Paul said no. Barnabas said yes. The disagreement was so severe that Acts 15:39 says they parted ways. The word in Greek suggests a sharp, painful split, and here's what happened next. Paul took Silas and went one direction. Barnabas took John Mark and went another. 2 missionary journeys became 4. The gospel spread twice as fast because one partnership ended. God didn't stop the conflict to preserve the relationship. He let the conflict happen because the mission was bigger than the partnership. Now here's the uncomfortable version for your life. Sometimes the person God removes is someone you love, someone good, someone who has genuinely been there for you. But the dynamic between you, the way you function together, the way you see yourself when you're with them, is keeping you inside a version of yourself that's smaller than what God is calling you toward. It's not about fault, it's about function. Some relationships, no matter how good, have a gravitational pull toward who you were rather than who you're becoming. And God will sometimes remove good things to make room for what's next. The third reason. The person had become what only God is supposed to be. This is the most convicting one, and I think it's the most common. There's a reason the first commandment is the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Not a suggestion. The foundation, because God knows what happens to humans when we place our primary weight, our security, our identity, our hope on anything other than Him. It buckles. It always buckles. And sometimes God removes a person not because the person was wrong, but because what you were doing with the person was wrong. You had made them your source, your stability, the thing you went to first when you were afraid, when you were uncertain, when you needed to know everything was going to be okay. And instead of redirecting you gently, God sometimes has to remove the substitute entirely. Abraham had Isaac, the son of promise, the miracle child, the one God had spent 25 years building toward. And God said, "Go to the mountain and offer him." Not because Isaac was bad, not because the relationship was wrong, but because something had shifted in Abraham's heart where Isaac had become more central than God. The one God gave had replaced the God who gave. And God didn't just redirect Abraham's attention. He took him to a mountain, had him build an altar, had him raise a knife, let it get all the way to the edge before he intervened. Not because God wanted Abraham's pain, because he wanted Abraham's surrender. He wanted to know, when it comes down to it, who is your God? Think about the relationship that ended in your life and devastated you more than you expected. The one where the grief felt disproportionate to the loss, where losing that person felt like losing yourself. That depth of devastation is often a signal of how central that person had become. God doesn't always remove the substitute because you were sinning. Sometimes He removes it because He loves you too much to let you build your life on something that can't hold it. The fourth reason. The person was connected to a version of you that God is done with. This is the quieter one. No drama, no betrayal, no falling out, just a slow drift apart that you couldn't explain and couldn't stop. When God is changing you, genuinely transforming you at the level of identity, not just behavior, the people around you don't always change with you. And staying in close proximity to someone who only knows the old version of you can become a gravitational pull backward. Peter understood this. The night Jesus died, Peter was standing by a charcoal fire in the courtyard of the high priest. The smell of that fire, the cold night air, the the group of people standing around asking questions, and he denied Jesus 3 times. That charcoal fire became the scene of his worst moment. Then, after the resurrection, Jesus finds Peter on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Peter has gone back to fishing, back to the old life, the old identity, the familiar thing. And John 21:9 says Jesus had a charcoal fire burning on the beach. Same smell, same setup, deliberate. Jesus didn't let Peter escape the memory. He brought him back to it, stood him in front of it, and asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" 1 question for each denial. Not to humiliate him, to overwrite it. To give Peter a new memory in the same setting so the old one didn't have the final word. But notice, Peter had to leave the fishing boat to get there. He had to leave the familiar, the old, the comfortable, to walk toward the fire on the shore where Jesus was standing. Some of the people who have left your life were tied to a chapter God is finished writing. And as long as they were there, part of you kept returning to that chapter, to the old identity, the old patterns, the old way of seeing yourself. God didn't remove them to hurt you. He removed them to keep you from going back. The 5th reason, and this one is the hardest, some people were sent into your life specifically to leave it. Their exit was the gift, not their presence. Back to Jonathan and David. Think about what David's life looked like with Jonathan in it. Jonathan was the king's son, heir to the throne. If Jonathan lived, David would always have someone to protect him, to advocate for him, to stand between him and the full weight of leadership. Jonathan loved David so fiercely that David would have leaned on that love naturally, reasonably, understandably. But God didn't call David to be protected. God called David to lead, to carry the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders without a buffer. And as long as Jonathan lived, David would never have to do that completely alone. He would always have a place to fall that wasn't God. So Jonathan died, right before the crown. And David, for the first time in his adult life, had no one. Just him and God, and a kingdom to build. And he built it. Sometimes the departure of the person you loved most is the very thing that puts you in the position you were destined to occupy. Not because God is cruel, but because the calling on your life requires a dependency on Him that certain relationships, even good ones, even holy ones, were preventing. The removal isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of the chapter you couldn't have entered any other way. Now I have to say something, because I've seen this kind of teaching misused, and I don't want that to happen here. This is not a framework for avoiding grief. It is not permission to emotionally detach from relationships because God might remove them anyway. It is not a reason to hold people loosely in a way that prevents you from loving them fully. The people God removes from your life were real. What you built with them was real. The grief you feel when they're gone is real, and it is allowed to be real. David didn't shrug when he heard Jonathan was dead. He tore his clothes. He wept. He fasted. He wrote a lament so beautiful it was recorded in Scripture and read for generations. He grieved fully. He just didn't let the grief become the final interpretation. And that's the invitation here. Not to dismiss what you lost, but to hold the grief in one hand and the question in the other. What is God building in the space they left behind? Because empty space in your life is not a wound. It's a room God is about to furnish. Here's what I want to leave you with. Ruth lost her husband. She lost her father-in-law. She lost the future she had planned in Moab. She left everything familiar and walked into a country where she was a foreigner, a widow, and nobody. And she ended up in a field owned by Boaz. Not despite her losses, because of them. If her husband had lived, she never would have followed Naomi. If she had stayed in Moab, she never would have been in Bethlehem during the harvest. If she hadn't been a widow in a foreign land with nothing, she wouldn't have been gleaning grain at the edges of a field, the exact place Boaz noticed her. Every removal led to the position. Every loss cleared the path. Every ending was, in hindsight, and navigation. You can't see that from inside the loss. Ruth couldn't see it from inside the grief. You don't get the hindsight while you're still in the middle. But the God who directed her steps is directing yours. And the people he has removed from your life, whether it makes sense yet or not, he removed them with the same precision he used to place them. Trust the removal. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because the one who did it knows exactly where you're going. And he needed you to travel lighter to get there,